Hi guys, my name is Barry and welcome back to the channel. I want to talk about remakes or horror remakes specifically in this video. I know that a lot of people have a grudge against horror remakes. That was the popular thing to do for a few years, was to hate on remakes because they're cheap cash grabs. Hollywood realised that remakes weren't doing too well anymore. So what they do now is they still bring out remakes, but they repackage them into requels or reboots. Anything like that, they want to repackage remakes and spin it around to make it look as if you're watching something that's not a remake. But in actual fact, what you're watching is essentially a remake. If you look at the Scream franchise, for example, and the Halloween David Gordon Green franchise, those movies, although they're classed as requels or reboots, essentially they're remakes because they are treading over old ground and they're just bringing back legacy characters so that you think it's not a remake, it's just a continuation of the original series. In essence, it is, but at the same time, what you're looking at is a remake. Now, there's certain things that remakes can do in order to make the movie better. That sometimes is to set the movie in a different place, give it a different feeling to it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But what I've realised as well recently is I've looked at all my favourite remakes of all time, like Evil Dead, The House of Eyes, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Last House on the Left. Some of these movies are fantastic and a lot better than their original. Some people would agree, some people would disagree. But one thing that I've thought to myself, I'm looking through all these remakes and I say to myself, there's something that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake from 2003 has over almost every other remake that's ever been made, American horror remake that is. And I thought to myself, how did I not notice that before? Now, with the exception of the Amityville Horror in 2005, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 2003 is the only horror remake that's been made that's been set in the same year as the original. And when I've looked at it, I've thought, that's right. Every other remake that's been made has been set in a different year, whether it be modern day or been set a few years after its original. If you look at Halloween from 2007, Rob Zombie's remake, although there's no specific year where the movie was made, they've got cell phones, etc. So there's certain parts of the film you can calculate when the movie was supposed to be set. Certainly wasn't set in the same year as the original. And you look at every other horror movie that's came out that's a remake, The Evil Dead, The Last House on the Left, I Spit on Your Grave, all those movies, House of Wax, none of those movies were set in the same year as their original. And that might be all their downfalls. They just don't have that feeling of the original movie. But when you look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's set in the exact same year as the original, and it feels like you are in the 70s in the movie. So if you're watching a horror remake and you've got that feeling of watching the original at the same time as watching the remake, they're doing something good. And it's blatantly obvious that you should set it in the same year as the original. It only makes sense. Now, when I say for the exception of the Amityville Horror, the Amityville Horror is also set in the same year as the original Amityville Horror, but it has to be because that's based on a true story. If it wasn't based on a true story, it probably wouldn't be set in the same year. But we can exclude that because it has to be set in that year. There's no other option for that. But the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a fictional movie that they could have set in 2003. But they decided not to do that. The best thing for them to do would be to set it in 1973, and it absolutely worked. Now, if you look at the new Halloween reboot that's coming out, whenever it's coming out, when would I like to see that be made? When would I like to see it be set? Modern day sounds like the most probable option for them to use, but when you set it in the modern day, and it's the same with other remakes that have come out before, you've got technology, so that limits certain things that you can do realistically. Like if someone's lost, they can just use their phone, whereas if you set it back in the 70s or the 80s, they've got less of a chance to use communication in order to get out of a situation. So if you're going to be rebooting a Halloween franchise, then honestly guys, I think maybe the 70s or the 80s would be the best bet to set this. I think 80s would be best because the 70s, you're limiting yourself a bit too much. Whereas with the 80s, a lot of people have got nostalgia for the 80s, so it would make sense to set it in the 80s. That way you don't have all the technology that you have today, and you can also have some cool set designs as well, some cool lighting, score, etc. So if I'm looking at the future of the Halloween franchise, I think the best place to set it would be in the 80s, which contradicts what I'm saying about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, having it set in the exact same year. But the difference with this Halloween franchise is you don't want it to be a remake of the 1978 classic. You want it to be its own thing. So set that in the 80s. But looking back on all the other remakes that have come out, I think my favourite remake, and it changes quite a lot, Evil Dead's up there as well, but I think ultimately the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 2003 is my favourite horror remake of all time. And when I sit back and think about it, I'm like, do you know what? It's probably because I'm watching a film that's set in the same year as the original movie that I loved. Therefore, I've got that feeling that I'm not only watching the original, but I'm watching something fresh at the same time. I've seen many horror remakes in my time, guys, and I could be lost here, but if I'm wrong, if we exclude the Amityville Horror because it's a true story or based on a true story, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 2003 the only horror remake that's set in the same year as its original? And if I'm not right about that, can you let me know down below which horror remakes are set in the same year? Don't make it obscure movies that wouldn't make sense. If you try and give us some big budget Hollywood movies that have been that are horror remakes, leave those down below, guys. I don't watch Japanese horror, so it could be the case that there's some American horror movies that's set in the same year as their Japanese originals. I don't know, like The Ring, The Grudge, etc. I'm sure they're just set in their modern day a couple of years after their originals as well, but it has to be the same year. So let me know down below, guys, if there's any horror remakes that have been set in the same year, and does it benefit the movie that it is set in the same year? If you look back in films like House of Wax from 2005, I really like that film. It's a really good remake. But would it benefit more if it was set when the original came out? The same with movies like The Last House on the Left or I Spit on Your Grave. Would they benefit from being set in the year that they came out? I think yes, at times they would. The Last House on the Left especially, because that's a great film, the remake. But I think to have that grungy feel, I think it would be better to be set in the 70s. If you look at The Hills Have Eyes, another fantastic example, a great film, but imagine that was set in the 70s. So much more you can do with that. So little technology as well. So you have to get out of your technology mind when you're watching these films. You have to go, oh, it's set in the 70s. They can't just pick up a phone and phone someone. Yes, I know that they've lost their signal in most of these films, but I know that you as the audience would probably go, oh, there you go, they've lost their signal again. But take all that out of the equation, set it in the 70s so that you go, they can't get a hold of anyone because there is no phones. So it makes the stakes higher when you're setting it back when the originals came out. But I'm waffling on, guys. Let me know down below what horror remakes came out in the same year, or what horror remakes were set in the same year as their original counterpart, and would it benefit the movie if it was? Anyway, guys, thanks a lot for watching again. Thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you soon.
Meeting adjourned.
I'll be right back.
What are you waiting for, huh?
Coming to get you, Barbara.
Ever played Skin the Cat? Someone's in the back! See!